Welcome back to the True Sports Physical Therapy Podcast. This one, I've been waiting a long time to record. I got my dear friend, my dear business partner, the COO of True Sports Physical Therapy, Dr. Timothy Michael Stone. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me, Yoni.
Thanks for being here. You just created an unbelievable course. You are
We.
now a co-educator on all things ACL as we launch the True Sports Guide to ACL Rehab. What makes this ACL course awesome?
Well, I think there's a few things that really like set this course apart from others that we've seen. I think some really big things. There's been a large movement away from the in-person course type atmosphere. So we tried to piggyback off that a little bit and really, create a course with an online presence, something that you can access in the clinic real time with your patients. So the first one is definitely that ease of access to it. The second piece really is we try to debunk the plethora of options and confusion surrounding the best way to treat an ACL. So, I felt as though when I first came out of grad school, I had a good grasp on exercises and movements and with a good strength and conditioning background, but I just didn't really know how to, put it in place at the right time with the right patient and kind of like just simplify this whole process. So we really set out, as our main goal is just to make sure this course is really succinct, really clear, and really simple. A nice stepwise approach to treating ACLs. And then I think the third piece that I really find interesting that's maybe slightly different to a trend in what's going on today is that we're seeing this huge shift in towards this criteria based approach to ACL rehab. That's beautiful. I think it has its place for sure, but I think our patients don't really understand where they stand during that time frame when they're doing the rehab. And as clinicians, part of generating buy-in and getting great success is really being able to explain where a patient is along the process. So we tried to marry both the criteria-based approach with the time-based approach so that people can really understand this is sort of what you need to move on and this is the time frame that we would expect you to do that in. But if you fall outside of that time frame, maybe you're going a little bit faster, maybe you're going a little bit slower, you still have something to fall back on to be able to give people like context to where they're at in this.
Yeah, you make a good point as you kind of explain that overarchingly, which is the therapist needs to know where the patient should be. That's step number one. Step number two is what do you do when they're not there? And I think this ACL course kind of speaks to that. How do you speed things up? Like they're killing it. How do you scale things back if they're struggling with things like motion or anterior knee pain? And that kind of comes up over and over again and really drives home the point, which is the therapist needs to know where the patient should be along the continuum. So should the patient. You just made that point, right? The patient has to understand, where am I in this 9-month, 12-month horizon? And what am I doing to consistently get better? Is that something that you find you're constantly explaining as you rehab these patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody wants their ACL to meet, the timeline approach of, a protocol that's sent from their surgeon or one that they've, followed and learned a lot. But I think I just don't know if I've ever had a patient that's met those standards like week to week.
Yeah.
And so it's more common to have somebody fall somewhere outside of that guideline than to fall within it.
Yep.
And so I think it's just difficult to have like this guide which isn't really realistic in everybody's case because everyone's an individual. It's a bit more of like the artistic side of rehab versus the science side of rehab. So yeah, I think just having both those touch points of just giving a general idea of where I am chronologically, but also like where I am from a metric based perspective as well gives you really good context to what to do next or how to speed up the process or maybe even how do I need to hold this patient back
Yeah.
because of you know some new tissues that are in their body that you can't stress even though some of the things that they're showing you would suggest that they should do
Yeah.
that from like a musculoskeletal perspective.
Yeah, yeah. I always say that I've rehabbed probably thousands of ACLs and none of them are the same. They all fit within a given context, but they're all so unique. So I have a patient come into me. I do a lot of talking to parents and coaches to try to explain this, which is here's the beautiful, easy pattern you're going to go along. This is the quote unquote protocol. Every single ACL I've ever seen struggles with one piece of this. Maybe it's motion, maybe it's quad recruitment, maybe it's anterior knee pain. It's usually one of those three. Maybe it's the mental side. Just get ready for that. And that's what I think this course does is prepares both the patient and the clinician to say, if it is not a million percent smooth, because it never is, how do you handle that? How do you scale that? You're so good at wrapping your patient's head around that. I think that's what makes you uniquely suited to deliver so much of the content in this course. What else would you say makes you uniquely suited to co-teach a course like this?
Well, I think, like you said, Yoni, we're doing this day in, day out. There hasn't been a day at True Sports since I started here 6 years ago where I haven't treated an ACL.
Yeah.
So I think this is our bread and butter. It really wasn't what I set out to do in going into the sports world. I really had like a love and fascination of, of hip rehab and things like that. I thought that was going to be really something that I could like bring to the table. And then, after doing this, it just being in this niche of sports PT, they just kept coming and just kept coming and just kept
Yep.
coming. And I think, that was something that wasn't necessarily like going after, but then I sort of started to develop this like love for treating it, and I think um it just is such a cool rehab process because you get to, one, take someone, who's just exited the operating room and is on the table and, can't walk, can't shower themselves, like needs help going to the bathroom. And then you get to, at the highest level, put them back on, a professional sports field where they're, generating millions of dollars of income. I mean, that transition period is just really, I think, very unique to most rehabs. So just the ability to see, dozens and dozens and dozens, and like you said, probably close to 1,000, by now. That really, I think, sets us apart from other courses or other people that teach courses. It's really like that practical application of experience with patients that makes us uniquely suited.
Now
I-
you have this unique approach now and experience level. You've seen thousands of them, right? Tell me about your background that makes you uniquely suited to deliver this information.
Yes, I think this is more of a general question about what we should do as PTs to position ourselves to best rehab our patients from a personal perspective.
Yeah.
So, what can I do to help me gain context around where my patient is in their life? And so, I was fortunate enough to play sports at a relatively decent level and play at the collegiate level and have a little bit of success there. But also, I think true for a lot of sports PTs, have some injuries, have some surgeries, and kind of go through the rehab process myself. So personally, I had surgery when I was in grad school, so it was a really great way to absorb, the didactic portion of a course, whilst going through that rehab portion, that rehab process for myself as well. So I think that was really interesting. And then I think, last but not least, it's just your your willingness to train and try, things for yourself first before you put your patients through them. So I think maybe not necessarily to the same intensity or weight level as some of our,
Pros.
pros,
Yeah.
linemen, like those kinds of things. Professional lacrosse players, I might not be able to put as much weight on the bar, but I do understand, what it feels like to be at an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10 RPE during a rear foot elevated split squat, or how it feels to, decelerate, change direction, for a 90-degree or 180-degree turn. So I think, that's a really important piece. I feel that PTs should go after at, whatever intensity that is for you, but just to feel, what it's like to do the drills is super important when you're trying to teach and coach the drills as well for your patients.
Yeah. Um, I totally appreciate your humility in that answer. You did win a national championship in college, which is something that a lot of therapists potentially have not done. I think if you didn't have that experience of winning a national championship playing for Salisbury, I think the way you make that up is by reaching those RPEs yourself, right? Is by putting yourself through the movements you're then going to ask your patient to do. I think that's imperative, and that should be highlighted. Uh, Akin in my world is I've never thrown a baseball 95 miles an hour, but I've thrown a baseball as hard as I possibly could through severe elbow pain. I know what that feels like. I can then try to take those life experiences and apply that to the patient. And I think we're going to get to it maybe a little bit later, but that's a big piece of creating buy-in. And I think this course does a great job of giving the therapist the tools to create that buy-in from the patient. And without that buy-in, you're not going to get outstanding results. You could give them all the science in the world. If you don't create that buy-in, you're not going to get the results that you want, more importantly, that the athlete wants. So don't belittle that national championship, but you make a great point of, hey, have I hit the RPEs? Have I done the movements? Have I worked on a box jump? Have I worked on a single leg box jump? Have I tried to teach myself how to change direction appropriately? Because only through that are you then going to be able to relate to your patients. What we've done in this course is given the therapist the tools to take themselves to the gym and try to teach themselves how to do it, because only through that are you then going to be able to kind of relate it to your patient. Anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I would just say, I think, just to piggyback on what you're saying there, a big portion of this course is movement principles, planes of direction,
Mhm.
different forms of loading. So I would, as you said, I think it's great to have a sports background or have played sports at a high level. You don't need to take this course, look at some of the exercises. We give you some really practical programming sheets as well, some Excel spreadsheets that you could just take these exercises and program for yourself.
Yeah.
I found myself doing that, you know, all the time when I first got out. And actually, what's really interesting, just from more vanity perspective, I think we are challenging. And we'll get into this more, like quadriceps function and strength so much in this. I was playing in a local washed up men's league this summer, and there was one of our guys was shooting pictures, and I saw a couple shots of me playing, and I compared what I looked like now to what I looked like back in college, and my quads are like twice as big. And I think whether or not that's good weight or bad weight, I think I have absolutely, like, my own training, like, changed the level of quadricep strengthening just from this, like, process of
Yeah.
rubbing off on me. So I think you can do the same if people are interested in taking this course. When they take the course, just use those little programming templates, throw some of the exercises that are, or the movement options or principles that we have on there, and just put them into your own programming and try them out and see how they feel for you.
Yeah, yeah, you gotta let it bleed into your own life. I've heard you make that case before where it's you when we talk about work-life balance, very often it's that work, like, bleeding into that life, right? And so you've developed, a pair of quadriceps that now can stabilize your knees, by virtue of the fact that you've incorporated some of this training into what it is you do on the daily. There's definitely value there. Also, you mentioned some of the information that we provide in this course gives you a lens through which you can see all of the information that's out there. I think times have changed so much. I'm just a little bit older than you. And so when I came out of graduate school, there wasn't information available. And that was the biggest hurdle to jump. Where do I get this stuff? How do I find out how to teach change of direction? I had to go and find an outstanding speed coach, a guy named Courtney Green, to teach me those things, how to change direction efficiently, effectively, and then try to apply it to what we do. Now it's everywhere. Information is everywhere. What the True Sports Guide to ACL Rehab does for you is it gives you a lens through which you can filter good information. And so now you can say, I know my athlete needs to be doing X. Let me go find information that fits into that rubric. So that's another reason I would encourage everyone listening to give this course a try is it gives you the foundation through which you can build upon and see and dissect and digest outstanding information. So that's something I always struggle with is, oh my God, there's so much stuff out here. This kind of simplifies that. So as we put together this course, give me the biggest challenge that you think this course solves for.
So I think it just a drastic increase in speed of your ability to take what's evidence based into practical
Hmm.
based application.
Hmm.
So I mean, you were just almost touching on it just a second ago, but when you come out of school, you have such a like research oriented background, right? You spend a lot of time in college, looking through papers, seeing, what is truly like evidence based. But that third that third pillar or second and third pillars of like the practical application, what works well for a
Yeah,
patient,
what do you do with it?
right? How do you do that? Studies don't really look at how to treat an ACL, from the first minute to the 45th minute that you have them in their office.
Hmm.
And so this course really really breaks that down, makes it really really simple to digest. What should I be like doing now? What should I do next session? How many times should I see you a week? We even sort of break things down simply enough as to, you know, we all know that we should get on a bike to improve range of motion, or maybe we don't.
Now you do.
Now you do.
Yeah.
But we teach you like, how to safely and effectively like get on the bike, get
Hmm.
off the bike. I know when I first started, I had my first ACL and they're like trying to get on the bike. I'm, just in this total, mind F of like, I'm going to kill this person. They're going to fall off. Like if I bend it too much, like if they go, is this going to cause like issues down the road? Am I going to increase swelling? Does their meniscus like handle
Yeah.
this? We
Yeah.
talk about like all those little basic things that I feel like I had questions when I first came out of school that I was fortunate enough to have a mentor like you kind of walk me through. But if you're in the middle of nowhere, this is a course that will help really like give you that mentorship and just speed up your ability to, you know, treat the next five that walk into
Yeah.
your office.
Yeah. I've seen that in your career, how you came on to the team about 6 years ago. I did my best to try to teach you like my theories and like the way I approach ACL rehab. And now I've seen every single therapist that we've brought on benefit from your tutelage. And that's what this course does. It takes Tim Stone, it takes all the outstanding PTs. And by the way, one of the world's preeminent surgeons, it takes them and it puts them on your computer screen. So they are your mentors. You are now the mentor to all the people that are going to download this course and take it. And it decreases that learning curve really quickly. And you do a great job of kind of dispersing that information. So I think that's another massive benefit. Too often you take a course and it's, well, studies show that you need blah, 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 blah. This course is Tim Stone holding your freaking hand and helping you get your athlete to where they need to be. That's worth its weight in gold. So I think that's really powerful. You remind me of one of the first ACLs I saw was a 300-pound, very mobile individual playing rugby. Toward playing rugby, played collegiate rugby. I just remember exactly what you just said, like praying to God I could get him onto this rickety ass bike in the clinic that I was working in. And he slid off the pedal, like slammed down, and both of us thought he retore his ACL, right? And just the fear that I felt, that the patient felt in that time. Now, he didn't re-tear it, but had I had a course like this, I'm not making mistakes like that. I'm approaching the bike, as simple as it is, appropriately. I would have done it at a better time, perhaps when he could have had better control. That's what this course does. It is truly how you rehab an ACL. And what you're hitting on is exactly why we started this practice and why we call it true sports physical therapy, because it's taking all the evidence base, all the research, everything from the lab. How do you apply it? And that's the gold here. Is we can all read studies, but how do you actually get that athlete to exactly kind of where they need to be? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
Totally agree.
okay. So when you looked out at the landscape of physical therapy, continuing education, and there's so much already out there, specifically as it pertains to ACLs, what did you notice was lacking?
Yeah, I think you also mentioned it a second ago. I think there's either this one camp where it's like, so evidence based that you go and take a course and you either sit in it live and you get lectured at for the whole weekend.
Yep.
It talks about like, you know, what does the research show on on strength, or what does the research show on range of motion, or what does the research show on pre-tears or glute med function
Yeah.
and injury prevention,
Yep.
and and all these kinds of things, or you go into courses that are produced by really large conglomerates
Yep.
that are probably seeing less of these on a daily basis than what we do. So, we attend to that kind of research, and we're really interested in making sure we keep up to date on those kinds of things. But this really comes from a point of what it is that we do every single day. And I think we as a company, if you are a PT at True Sports, this you will see more of these in on a yearly basis than anywhere else at any other institution. So there's really no better people to learn from in this in this in this course than the PTs themselves that work here. So that I think is really what separates this from a lot of the other courses that I've sort of seen that are out there. It's just like a much better practical real life situational application.
Yeah. One of the things you do that's so awesome is applying your strength and conditioning background. I think that's something that was so needed in the landscape. There's so many courses on what that patient is doing on the table. Very rare is it for me to see what the athlete is doing at month 3, 4, 5. I find that as a clinician very challenging, a very challenging point of the rehab process, because now you're not a physical therapist. Now you're a sports physical therapist. Now you're a strength coach. And so, how do you load? When do you load? How do you isolate? I think more importantly, and the course does a great job of it, and by that I mean you do a great job of periodizing. And how do you plan appropriately? When do you pull on that strength and conditioning knowledge?
Yeah, so I think I mean immediately, right? I think from day one, when we're trying to gain quad recruitment,
Yeah.
we're already manipulating sets, reps, tempo. We're utilizing um, blood flow restriction, NMES. All those things are fall within that strength and conditioning world of progressive overload.
Hmm.
I think mostly however, I think you need to really rely on it in that advanced strengthening phase of rehab. So we've included a specific phase that looks at that particularly, and but we also include it in the earlier phase of loading as well. I think as you move through the rehab, and this was probably a really large challenge for us as we were going through the course, is day one, week one, and month one, you can almost write out on a like piece of paper exactly what you want the patient doing on each one of those days to meet those goals. And you know, and we've done that
And
in the
that's what you
course.
did.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So that's an awesome piece right there if you're unsure about what that looks like. But from after you get them off the table and they start independently walking, the variables just increase exponentially. You have all these different options that you can apply in your programming to these patients. So what we really attempted and thought we've done a really good job of is in those early and advanced stages of strength training, really break it down as simply as possible and as linearly as possible, and from a movement pattern perspective, so that we give you these different directions of movements to utilize. And I think that is like a huge piece of this is now we're just decreasing the variables of the decision making that the PT has to make as they go through this process. So that's probably where it's applied most common.
Yeah. You make an awesome point there, because I jumped to month 3 and 4 as massive challenges, and that's when you become a strength coach. You just said you're a strength coach from when they walk in. And I appreciate that correction because too often, and we go over this every single interview you and I conduct of a prospective uh, teammate in true sports is what does that first session look like? Well, why did you choose this amount of time to have them do, let's call it a prone hang or a heel pop, right? Is that enough time? What do we know about tissue adaptability and how much intervention or input do we need to provide? That's the strength coach. It starts on day one, not on month 3. So I stand corrected, but that's a really great point. And you did do an awesome job of kind of lining that out and giving the therapist a rubric of how do I work through these stages? And how do I work through these stages, always keeping in mind that my intervention has a purpose, not just because it says so on a piece of paper, but it has a purpose to achieve this given goal. Extension, you got to provide enough time under tension, right? Hypertrophy, what are your parameters, right? Recruitment, what am I trying to do? How long am I creating those holds so that that brain can begin to talk to the desired muscle? So I definitely kind of appreciate that point. It's also, dude, I wish I would have done this when I looked at graduate programs when I was going to school. Is look at maybe what you want your specialty to be, in my case, orthopedics and sports, and then look at the institution and look at the people teaching it and where is their focus? How many ACLs have they seen? I'll take courses, and I've taken courses to get to this point, and I'm learning from clinicians that live in a lab. I'm learning in clinicians that see one, two, three ACLs a year. You see one, two, three ACLs in your morning session, and that's really powerful, and that's what this does is it speeds up that learning curve just from all that experience. So I think there's a tremendous amount of value there. So sounds like a great course, sounds like a course I want to take, sounds like a course I had a small hand in creating. So walk me through those steps and phases of the True Sports Guide to ACL Rehab.
Yeah, so there's the really, I would say, like generally 3 to 4 big buckets of phases that we then break down further. So the first one is the early intervention, and then second one would be early loading. We have advanced loading, and then we have more of your return to sport phases. So those are like the three broad overview or four overview. Um,
Same again, break them down again.
so we have the early post up, okay? Then we have our early strength,
Yep.
then we have advanced strength, and then we have our return to sport.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and you put in milestones.
Yeah. So in between those phases, there are a lot of different moving parts, and so we brought in different phase chunks within those larger phases to sort of teach and educate on how to reach X goal, like this goal, but also on how to decrease those variables that we spoke about. So, for example, in our initial phase, we put in an entire session of what we do on day one.
Yeah,
You know, we do exactly what we do for week one. Okay. And then we do exactly what we do for up to month one, where we're getting the patient back to walking independently. And then we head into that more strength and conditioning portion. So we have our initial loading strategies. Okay. And so this is where patients will start to really develop like a competency around squatting, lunging, single leg tap downs, posterior chain exercises, things like that. In that more advanced stage that comes after that, we're looking at all those same or similar movements, plus a couple more that we probably wouldn't attempt in that earlier phase. But we're also adding different much more complex loading patterns, or different ways to sort of challenge the tissue in ways that you might not be able to, or load the joints as you might want to in that earlier phase.
and you don't get that stuff out of a textbook, and that's what I love about this course. Playing with angles, playing with tempo, playing with pace, is something that doesn't really show up in the studies. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you're actually showing the clinician, here are the things you gotta think about, and we give you options as to how to put it in the program. It also does a great job of explaining what do you do when you're seeing them 3 days a week? You know you have to get to X. You need full range to get out of that early phase, right? You need really good quad recruitment to get out of that early phase. So that's the way you break up your individual sessions. Today's theme is motion. What have I done to get that athlete's full range of motion? Or the second visit of that week, today's theme is recruitment. What am I doing to help them get that recruitment so that we can get them off that table? You're playing with all these variables as you move along the rehab process. You have to pick a given goal for that session. This course shows you what those goals should be and how to achieve those goals.
Yeah, and I think also too, like to your point there, we one thing that's I found confusing when I was going through this, when I had the ability to work with someone 3 days a week, is what does that look like compared to the person what I'm working with 2 days a week, or should I work with this person 5 days a week if I can? And so we actually specifically broke down, how you could look at your sessions from a 2 day a week perspective and a 3 day a week perspective, just because in that outpatient environment, that's probably the most likely way in which you're going to see these patients. So there's differences to the rehab process when you have the ability to see them 2 days a week versus 3 days a week. And we talked about that, the programming and the Excel spreadsheets that we provide within those phases. We change those based on how many times
Mhm.
you're seeing the patients during the week as well. So it just sort of like I felt I really struggled, when I'm seeing someone 2 days a week and you get into that later stage when you're trying to do some, cutting and lifting. Well, once you move into that phase, if you're doing twice a week, you've now just stripped one day of strength training because you have to bring in the plyometric portions or the change of direction stuff. So how do you manage that? What do you do with that? Should it look like you train all body parts equally on the first day and then do a change of direction? Or should you do a little change of direction on both days? Or should you really target quads for the most part on that first day and move into the change of direction on the second day? There's a lot of questions around that. And we sort of break that down in this course, and compare that to options where you can see a patient a little bit more frequently as well.
Yeah. It also gives you a few levers to pull and options because that patient's gonna come in, if they're still looking really weak or they don't have awesome recruitment, then it can give you options. You need to be doing more of this at home because we only have twice a week, or um, you're doing great with that stuff. Let me teach you some of the rhythmic drills and the timing drills because that's where you're struggling. Take those at home. When you come in here, I'm going to show you how to load this thing. So you got to meet that patient where they are. Your addition, and this really was all you in terms of adding it to the course, of giving the therapist those Excel spreadsheets to pull from. Um, I haven't seen that in courses. It really doesn't exist elsewhere. I think that's super unique about the value that you're really providing. So let's dig in a little bit clinically. Walk me through what you think is the most complex portion of the True Sports ACL Rehab course.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this as you move along the course, or in general, as you move along patients' rehab process, the earliest stages have a lot less variables attached to them.
Yeah.
Right, there's one, two, three goals that you're working on. The movements are really simple, but as you go through your rehab and you get to those change of direction phases, the return to sport phases, the complexity, the variables, the speed at which you're trying to like watch somebody do something and see what they're having issues with
Yep.
gets a lot more difficult.
Yep.
So I would say in general for ACL rehab, that is the most complex portion of rehab. And I think too, that's what we were really challenged with when we're producing this course. Well, how do we simplify that for people? Um, but also not put them in this box where every single one of your ACL patients ends up doing the same change of direction
Yeah.
program when they come back. So we really tried to derive different principles of these stages, whether it was like open and closed environments, whether they were contact or non contact, or whether they were what we call like chaotic or non chaotic drills. Those were the kinds of pieces that we broke down the later stages of change of direction into. Um, and then we filled in the blanks with some examples of those exercises, but we talk about, looking on YouTube or looking on social media or, taking other courses in strength and conditioning where you can then get this bucket of what's a contact, chaotic, closed environment drill,
Drill.
and then pick an exercise that you've seen or a drill that you've seen elsewhere and just like plug and play into that specific portion or that specific goal for that
Yeah.
day. So
Yeah.
I think that's difficult to do.
I think it's really difficult to do. I think one of the reasons it gets so much more complex as we move along the rehab process is twofold. One, you don't get this in school. Like, they can't teach you this complex stuff in school because they have to be talking about EKG or they have to be talking about wound care or burn care or whatever the hell else they're teaching you. So you never get to those later stages. And I see that a lot as we interview and we talk to newer graduates or people that are working in a more general population. There's just not enough time and experience with that later stage stuff. They're busy spending time with their TKEs, and that plays back into the previous point, which is finding a mentor that only does this. So I think that makes it complex. Secondly, and really simply, I think is planes of motion, right? And so when you're getting your flexion and extension, it's basically one plane. Once we're out there and say we're back to throwing or cutting or dodging, holy cow, so many planes, right? And the course does a really good job of breaking down the planes that we're looking in, and that's the way you progress the athlete. If I had a nickel for every time I worked with an NFL athlete and he tells me, yeah, we're doing some change of direction stuff, and we're doing some resisted running, and I'm like, well, have you learned how to move in all of those planes? And they're like, what the hell does that mean? I'm like, well, have you learned to move laterally in the frontal plane? Have you worked on box jumps? Have you worked on deceleration, acceleration in that plane? Have you worked on it transversely? Have you worked on rotation? Too often, that stuff is totally skipped. It's okay, we're at month 3, so let's start running. What have you done to get there? This course, you do a great job of breaking that down vis-a-vis planes of motion, I think, is the lens you look through.
Yeah, that is a big portion of it. And what I think, again, to like piggyback off your right there is if you're, you know, giving an athlete a specific drill and your goal is to look at how they move in that transverse plane, well, there's not a ton of drills that happen on the field where you're only going to move in the transverse plane.
Right.
So, how do you pick or design a drill that predominantly moves in that plane, but still has a sprinkle of some other things, but it's just not the major piece that you're looking at. Now, when the athlete goes ahead and completes that drill or is doing that drill, when you're giving them feedback, how do you give them feedback on the transverse plane portion of it? Because that's your goal. How do you make that part better and sort of leave the other pieces to
Mhm.
the side? And so, that's what makes this portion much more complex. But as you said, like just being able to break it down into the planes and then break it down into like the intensities of the drill makes it a lot more simpler. And on top of that, I think if you are a new grad or if you are new to this, I think we do get planar movement in school. So we do
Mm.
understand those things. And so all you're doing is trying to place that knowledge with a much faster, more aggressive, more ballistic type movement. So if you can make that jump, then it sort of puts the puzzle pieces together and it makes it seem much more simple.
Yeah. So, if we take a small step back from that change of direction, although we'll come back to it. Um, one of the pieces that I struggle with mightily was the hypertrophy phase, and that's one of my favorite phases of the entire ACL rehab course. Just give me your overview of how to approach the hypertrophy phase and how you know your athlete's ready for that.
Yeah, so they they are going to have some level of hypertrophy training from day one again, obviously. But when you get to the meat and potatoes portion of it, you're starting that advanced loading. That's where you're going to see like majority of that, muscle size change. And so I think the important pieces that are involved in this phase are really just progressing the different loading patterns that we do in that earlier phase. So if we've created some competency like with body weight, or lighter level lows, just to ensure that the patient's able to move through those different movements. Now, when we get to that hypertrophy phase, this thing needs to be freaking hard. Like it's
Yeah.
got to be a battle. Like you should be working, and you can see again in our programming things like you need to be working in eights, nines, and tens of your RPEs, right? We're no longer working in our sixes like we were in that earlier phase where we're just trying to develop um, the ability to do the movement. Now, like you should fail once a
Fair.
time in PT, right? Like things should be that difficult that when you come back the next time, whatever tissue group you were working on the time before is fried, and then talking about the programming, the PT can come in and say, like, well, okay, like now we don't need to work on that today because we can give you 48 hours to kind of like recoup, rest. We'll work on some different groups or some different movement patterns that won't really stress those. So I think the overarching theme of the hypertrophy is that it needs to be really hard,
Yeah.
and you're following along that principle of progressive overload. Okay. So the recording of your weight needs to be really good so that you can increase the next time they come in. The RPE needs to be recorded so that you can kind of match that every single time. So I think those are like the big pieces that are really important in terms of like how to address hypertrophy in patients with ACL reconstruction. And then I think the last little tidbit would be a little bit of that tech side of things would be um, you have to have blood flow restriction. You
Mhm.
can't get through this phase effectively without some sort of limb occlusion. And I might add NMES to that as well, just to increase the recruitment as well as increasing hypertrophy. But I just think now it's so accessible and relatively cheap that if you want to treat patients and you want to get their limb size similar and you want to give them ability to down the road show better absolute strength and then show the ability to produce ballistic movements, elasticity, stiffness, all those kinds of qualities, you can't get there unless you fill the hypertrophy bucket first. And I think you need blood flow restriction to do that.
Yeah, I think you need blood flow restriction, and I think you have to force the athlete to use that limb appropriately, effectively, and force them to work hard. That's the biggest thing, right? We have to provide enough stimulus, and that's where you're using that RPE. I think therapists are really worried to do that. I don't know if it's like this misconception of what the graft can handle, or even, by the way, where the graft is tensioned. One thing this course provides the therapist is confidence in that which we know, which is you got to ramp that stimulus to create growth. It's exhausting to watch patients come in having tried to, been educated elsewhere to do these bilateral squats, and they're invariably going to live on their unaffected limb. And so, one of the things I love about this course is it's easy to say, oh, well, go unilateral.
What
That
is that?
what First of all, what is that? Second of all, how do we do that without killing their knee? Because you got the
Right.
the pain,
Right.
right? And we don't wanna incur any other types of damage, and so there's so many pearls and ways to work around that to get them to use that limb and to get them to do it at a high enough RPE or stimulus to force growth. You mentioned that one of them's BFR, one of them's, E-stim, but how do you isolate that limb? That's the gold in this course, and that I feel like that's what made this section of the rehab process the most enjoyable to me because it used to be the most daunting. That's really tough to get the athlete to work that freaking muscle hard enough for it to grow when you're working around pain or whatever other maybe misconceptions you might have.
I really let me take a little more of a dive onto
Yeah,
single leg use or that unilateral use piece because we talked about like these concepts and these broad categories and we're sort of describing you need to do hypertrophy. Same thing, like we're talking about these things that were taken from a book. Now doing a 9 out of 10 RPE on a rear foot elevated split squat where all the rate of perceived exertion is on
it's the
the
back.
back leg
Yep, yep,
is a 1 out of 10 on the front leg, right?
yep.
Or the exercise is just not designed well enough to really produce what you want to get out of the front limb. So, um, are you meeting the goal that you set out with every single rep that you do with a patient, and is a huge piece of what we talk about. Is the exercise that you're doing truly unilateral? I think broadly PTs are not great at classifying what buckets exercises fit into, and so we classify them into your bilateral, your split stance, and then your truly unilateral based exercises. So I think those split stance or like B stance positions, people will refer to them as a lot, get bucketed into this
Yep.
unilateral. Well, that's, you know, for someone with two healthy knees, I think you could maybe push it towards that side of things, because they're just using that um, the leg that's not working as like a stability piece.
Yep.
When you're dealing with someone who has an injury to the knee or they have an ACL reconstruction, their body is trying to protect them from stressing that knee at all costs. And so now the B stance or that split stance limb use really becomes an overload of the healthy limb
Right.
and not the limb that we're trying to work. So whilst we do some split stance based activities, I think predominantly we really need to spend most of our time in that unilateral position. So if we need to add upper extremity supports to take a little bit of load off that limb, I think that's a really important piece of this. But how do we remove the other limb from the equation? One is, can't pick bilateral and you can't pick B stance movements for people that are just going to cheat no matter what. And then, two is, are we getting out of the exercise what we think
Yeah.
we're getting out of it? Because if we're not seeing that, or if there's a disconnect there, that hypertrophy is, you're going to be scratching your head 6 months down the road saying, man, like they're reporting 8s and 9s for this whole entire time, but like the limb hasn't grown like circumference from a circumference
Yep.
perspective at all, or it's 1 or 2 centimeters
Yep.
bigger. Well, you have to hold yourself accountable and look back at what you're doing. Well, were they really sitting on that leg when they're doing the exercise? And well, let's check the circumference of the other limb.
Yep.
Did that grow exponentially? Because if that happened, now we really got to look at our program and say to ourselves, crap, I
Am
think
I
we were
getting what
training the
I
other leg
Yeah.
and not the
Yeah.
leg we're supposed to be training.
So I'll ask you a simple question, which is how do you know you're getting what you want at a given exercise?
Yeah. So one is develop the parameters around the exercise that minimize the variables that can can that can kind of come about in the exercise.
So
So
selection.
selection first,
Okay.
right? So if you can get someone to shift their knee anteriorly enough, where we know that's going to increase squat. So how can we set up the environment to ensure somebody does that? So one way that we'll teach this is, for any of our single leg or split stance exercises, we'll ensure that there's a target for them to go forward to. Okay.
To push their knee to hit.
Towards. Yep.
Yep.
And so that knee sort of travels over the toe. We know there's better quad recruitment there. Um, the other piece that will go with this is what's happening at the trunk. And actually, one of our colleagues posted this recently, arguing that the trunk position is probably more important than the knee position. Now,
Mm.
I think both those things come into the equation. So, in terms of trunk position, we're trying to look for a more vertically placed trunk. So, how can you set up parameters surrounding that to ensure that that happens? So,
Yep.
that might be a wall,
Yep.
right behind their back. It might just be tactile cueing to ensure they're kind of meeting those demands. So, setting up the demands of the exercise that really decreases the ability to move outside of what you're trying to get.
Yeah.
So that would be like the biggest bucket. If they're not showing you what you want them to do in an exercise because there's too many variables involved, adding 50 cues never results in
No.
what you want to
Makes it
see. It
worse.
just makes it harder
Yeah.
and worse. And then you spend so much time, and then you get out of the exercise and you're like, man, I just wasted that like
Yep.
integral like opportunity I could have been working the thing I wanted to do. So just shift, change the exercise, dump it, and go to something else. We find that's a much better way to sort of like hit what you want to hit.
Yeah. And then all the way back to what you started with is try the exercise yourself. How do you cheat? How do you run away from your knee or quad? I think it's totally worthwhile. When they're done with the exercise and they come in the next session, how do you know that the last session was worthwhile?
Typically, I'll try to watch them come down the stairs, and if they look like they're buckling down the stairs, it's we're in a pretty good place.
Okay.
And then yeah, then we're just asking the patient, like um, even in the same session,
Yep.
how did that go? Where do you
Where do you feel
feel
it?
the work? Was it hard enough? Was it challenging enough? Is your leg shaking while you're doing it, or is it the back leg
Right.
shaking while you're doing it? But yeah, definitely the next day, I think it's one, just watching them walk in as we always do. I think the stairs is a really good way to see, like, as they go down stairs, to see like if they're kind of like having issues. You hit quad pretty good, but then you're just following up and talking to the patient. So I think putting your hands on a patient here comes in handy. So if you really really tried to work on quad hypertrophy or just stress that like anterior chain in general, just like putting your hands on their legs and feeling their muscles and asking them to squeeze and saying like, is there a different level of soreness
Yeah.
here in the one that we're trying to hit versus the one that we're not? I mean, those are very very simple
Yeah,
ways to
but
do it.
often
For
overlooked.
sure, for
Um,
sure.
is your quad sore? What can I do to make your freaking quad sore? It's not gonna
Right.
grow unless it's sore. So, the other thing you mentioned there was when you were talking about cues and ways to constrain an exercise to get out of it that which you want, you use the example of tactile cues using a wall. In my head, I was, like, thinking we put a foam roller in front of their knee so that their knees these are nearly no cost options. And I think too often we get so fancy with lights and bells and whistles for cues, whereas um, we've been able to rehab before we got force plates, before we got BFR, before we had stim units in office. We were able to use very simple things to achieve the desired goal. Fancy isn't always better. John Wooden said, "Don't be fancy, just be good." And the way you're good is using that which you have because you know your goal. That's what you get out of the course. Now you know your goal. We make that really clear. You make that really clear in the course. Um, you don't have to get too fancy to achieve those goals. The next phase that I really see therapists needing some tutelage around is the plyometric phase. So break down the course of how it addresses the plyo phase.
So we start in this sort of like pre-running, pre-plyo type section. And so basically what we're trying to do there is to achieve some of the same joint angles that you might get when you're doing plyometrics or change of direction exercises for that matter too. Um, but not incur the same amount of forces that go through the limb. And so one way that we do that, we show that in the course, is just by adding a lot of speed to your drills. So
Yeah.
you might unload them, but add more speed to that triple flexion, triple extension piece that the limb's always going to go through when they're doing plyometrics or running. Another way is doing them on two legs versus one leg. So we talked about trying to get away from the bilateral stuff, like when we're talking about the hypertrophy and strengthening phase. But here we sort of like bring it back in, right? Because we can decrease the load by 50% to that limb. So that's a really important piece in sort of seeing if the patient's like comfortable getting their knee into that position at those speeds.
Yeah.
So that's the pre portion. All your typical sagittal plane based movements, your lateral and transverse based movements applied with those thoughts. So we're still following that like planar movement piece, and then we move into the truly plyometric portion of the course, where we have a specific phase or a specific section that fits into our advanced loading phase, where we really break down plyometric drills from a planar perspective, a limb use perspective, bilateral single leg, and then we really dive into this major concept of extensive versus intensive plyometrics as well.
Yeah. And those are all nuances that I feel like there's no way in hell you're getting those in grad school. So this is clearly kind of that next stage. Too often we see athletes just progressing to a run, just like we were talking about with change of direction based on a time perspective. And it's they haven't done anything fast, right? And so they go from a heavy load, your hypertrophy phase, to this running or force production phase, and they haven't done anything fast. So maybe it's starting with an exercise they can do. They feel it in the desired muscle, let's say quadriceps with a squat, let's say. And can you speed them up,
Right.
right? Can they do it quickly? And playing with the rate can be equally as effective as playing with the load, at times more effective. So that's definitely something that I learned kind of watching you move through this course and the goal that's inside this.
I think one thing here too to understand is that we've taken such a better approach at the testing piece of this to ensure that patients have the physiological qualities to be able to produce those movements when we ask them and have set up parameters that you can see within the course as well, to know that someone's ready to run, or to know that someone's ready to do like heavier plyos, or to know that they're ready to return to the field. But I'll say this because I used to be quite a hater on the testing side of things. I just didn't feel the practical like field test that we had, unless you had a Biodex in your clinic,
Yep.
you were able to really produce results that gave you any better insight
Yep.
into where the patient is and where they were going forward. Now I think we have been able to kind of like ditch some of the older testing and really look at the ones that we really truly value and that we really think represent good quad function for the most part. But in throwing all of that out, if you didn't have the ability to test someone, you should be able to subjectively, or quasi objectively be able to see if someone's ready to do these different drills by just progressing the drill.
Right.
So, if you want to understand someone can do a single leg hop, well, you can start them on a tap down. If they're successful on a tap down, load the tap down. If you're successful at loading the tap down, strip the weight, do the tap down really fast.
Hmm.
Okay. Add some load to a really fast tap down, and then break down the different portions of jumping. Can they decel the limb effectively by just landing on it, essentially?
Hmm.
Can they get off the limb by just accelerating off of it, but not having to deal with the landing component of it? Now you've just been through this whole process where you can say, okay, like they've had no problems with all those things. And that might be 2 reps at each thing. It could happen all in one session, or it could happen over a month or even longer. But you're now able to say, like, with really high confidence, if I move the needle 1% beyond breaking down those 2 portions of jumping and landing to just jumping and landing
Yep.
like it's supposed to be, like I'm really confident that person's going to be able to do that without having a 85% QI or
Yep.
whatever it is that you're looking for. So I think while that, when you're new at this, you might not be as good at sort of like making those jumps. The testing is really, really important. And I think it does really help us with the blind spots that we have as PTs when you think you're there
Yep.
and you're not there. But also, I think what this course does a really good job of is helps arm you with the ability to assess the patient's progress from a subjective or quasi like objective
Yeah.
perspective to see
Yeah.
if they're ready for the next level.
Yeah. I love that because it gives the therapist the ability to progress a patient post-op ACL really smoothly without needing force plates. But if you have force plates,
Use
we
them.
use them,
Right.
and we have an expert that teaches how to use them inside of this course. If you have a tin deck, use a tin deck. It's $150. It's a step down from all that information you can get from force plates, but we're going to teach you how to use a tin deck. If you don't have any of those, Tim, in the last 2 minutes, you just taught us how to assess the athlete, progress the athlete without any of it. And we want to give as many levers to pull as we can to therapists in this course, and that's exactly what's in this course. So, dude, there's a lot there. There's a lot there to dive into, and we'll definitely cover a lot more. So, as we look to wrap this up, just give me, what did you learn while you produced this course?
The first thing that I will learn was nothing to do with PT, and that's just how difficult it is to be on camera. I have the utmost respect for people who do that on a daily basis. I think it's really, really difficult.
You did great.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
You did too. So my issue with that was, like, as soon as the light turns on, I could just completely
Like,
forget
okay.
yeah, no idea what I'm going to say. So we did a little dive into using a whiteboard with some bullet points and things like that, and then we finally made the executive decision. For me, I needed to have a teleprompter.
Yes.
So embarrassingly enough, like I had to write my thoughts and feelings down on the page and then read them
What were your
verbatim.
feelings? What feelings did you include in that?
Nervousness.
Nervousness.
Yeah, for the most part. So I put those on it went much smoother beyond that. I don't have the ability as you do to ab lib and and kind of swerve and come back to the right point
Yeah, it's called
at the
BSing.
right
Yeah,
time,
yeah,
at the right time. And so that really kind of helped me do that. So I think that was probably like the most challenging piece to me. I think the clinical stuff, right? It's regurgitating like what we already know.
yeah.
I actually did find it much easier when I'm cueing or talking about an exercise that I do. I didn't need any of that stuff then.
'Cause
That
it's
just
what you
felt
do.
so natural,
Yeah.
like to do that and to kind of show those things. But the intros, the meat and potatoes on this terminology and that
Yeah.
terminology and things like that, I really needed a lot of help with that. So
So to the millions of people that are gonna download this course, just cut us some slack on those intros. They're
yeah,
gonna get better.
yeah,
They're gonna get better. Okay.
yeah.
What else?
I think it challenged us. We produced this course one time,
Yep.
and then we kind of sat down to evaluate it, and it had all these tidbits that we felt like we offer that other places don't, but we didn't feel like it had this comprehensive approach from day one all the way to
Mhm.
the end of the field. And like, what do I do if I'm with a patient that's 6 months in and like I'm scratching my head over how to get them to the next level? So we sat down after filming for 3 months and putting it together over 6 months and said, look, like, I don't think
This isn't good enough.
it's not good enough. And so we took a dive back in, we restructured the whole thing. And so just communicating and figuring out what is it that we do? What is it that we do without thinking about that other people have to think
Yeah.
about, to begin with? And how do we articulate, the importance of these different concepts? I think that's what's so tough about producing a course that has a really good 360-degree view on the rehab of anything.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of these things, like brushing your teeth, after a while you kind of go through them, but they weren't like that 6 years ago
Mhm.
for me, and I did have to like write those things down. So coming up with the ability to show um, the basic steps on how to do this, but also giving people the tidbits that really have been able to separate us in true sports in general, like in this field of treating ACL reconstructions. That's tough to kind of put on paper. So I learned a lot about actually doing the rehab whilst and now apply that to my patients. I'm applying this course to my patients every day, um, because it gave me a lot of structure, a lot more structure to my programming, a lot more structure to um, looking at when to get feedback from a patient or when to jump to the next level. So I think that was a really, really big piece that I learned from doing this course.
Yeah. And it comes across just in terms of the way this finished product, the way you took that look and tried to figure out how do we program it appropriately. I think it's really nicely organized and it will be evolving. We're going to get even better at it. I'm sure we'll do an ACL rehab part two.
Can I flip those questions back around on you? What do
All
you
of them?
think?
You want to do another
Yeah,
hour?
let's do another hour.
Yeah.
I'll do this all day.
Mm.
What do you feel like you felt was the most difficult portion of completing this course or of putting a good product on paper?
Not settling. I think getting feedback, being open to feedback from clinicians, from Dr. Dries, who you hear from in the course, from you as a co-presenter, and being able to go back to the drawing board when necessary, I think was a massive learning experience for me. To go back, assess what you've done. Is it good enough? Does it meet our true sports standard? Is it going to help every clinician? Is it going to help the beginner? Is it going to help the vet? And is it clearly articulated? That was that was really tough for me, and I hope I learned from that. Yeah, I hope I got better with that process. Any other questions? It's
Um,
not a podcast till the guests ask questions.
what's your favorite part of the course, Yoni?
My favorite part of the course, I would say, was bringing in an orthopedic surgeon. It's so unique. We don't know what the F happens in that OR, and he distills it beautifully and gives us insight as to why he's doing what he's doing. He's a guy who operates from a standpoint of trying to do what's very best for the patient. He has changed the way he does ACL reconstruction. I think that was eye opening for me to hear. It's what I look for in a surgeon. So when patients come to me and say, who should do my ACL rehab? It's those tidbits. I want a guy who's doing it a little bit differently than 5 years ago because we have new interventions. And it makes me really nervous when a guy is doing exactly what he did when he came out of graduate school. That's across every profession, specifically with orthopedic surgery. So I think that was one of my absolute favorite pieces of this course is hearing from a renowned orthopedic surgeon. Okay, let's go to the Eric Cressy lightning round. Ready? Make it
Nice.
quick, Tim
Okay.
Stone. Here we go. What's the most important thing you needed to learn when you came to True Sports about rehabbing athletes post ACL reconstruction?
I think I would say that 0 degrees of extension is not full extension, or almost there on range of motion is not there on range of motion. So by that, what I mean is if there's a 5% deficit in hyperextension comparatively between sides, or 5% on flexion, that really is going to
It
dictate the
matters.
outcome of the entire rehab. Your plyos won't look good, like your change of direction stuff won't look good. They won't be able to generate enough hypertrophy on the limb because they can't lock the knee out. They won't be able to generate enough turnover in their stride because their flexion's not similar, or it just feels freaking weird for them to do it because it's not the same.
Mhm.
And when you're constantly driving that, this is not the same as my other leg, this is not the same as my other leg feedback loop, it doesn't produce a good result. So I think that's my favorite part of the course is that early phase. Um, we stress that so well here to our PTs, and all of our PTs can run back that first week, to us exactly the same. It looks the same here in Glen Burnie where we're filming as it does over in Timonium where our PTs do this early on. So that's a huge piece of this is just getting that early extension. So I think that's probably the most important thing that I need to learn when I got here. And thankfully, I really got that from you. I think my first patient, I remember sitting in the back room of Fells Point doing one of these, and you coming in and sort of like throwing me to the wall, so to speak, but looking at it and saying how's the extension? I was like, good, because her leg was sitting flat on the table. You walked over immediately, grabbed the heel, popped it up, and couldn't get anything beyond that like 1 degree of hyperextension, and then test other side. No, they have like 6 or 7 degrees of hyperextension. I didn't understand that, and I
Right.
think that's still an issue that we're
Yep.
seeing. So that was a huge learning curve for me, but I think once I figured that out, things got a lot better
Yeah.
really, really quickly.
Yeah. Credit to you. Okay. ACL wise, what have you changed your mind about in the last 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think I touched on this earlier with the testing piece. I was just really frustrated, I think, at what the research had shown in the practical, like field jump testing and things like that. And so I basically threw them out because I didn't think that the triple hop from a subjective portion
Yeah.
really like
Didn't matter.
it doesn't show
Didn't
you
show
the
you anything.
quality that you're looking at, which is, do they have proficient like quad function in change directional plyometric drills? And I just felt like that wasn't being shown well. And so instead of like pushing needle try to find more stuff, I kind of threw them out and took that approach we talked about earlier too, where it was just like sequential, little bits sequential. And so I've changed my mind on that immensely, mostly to people. I would say one of our former colleagues, Chelsea Cooman, she was huge in sort of like pushing me, challenging me to sort of like look into that stuff more. And then actually one of our PTs in this office, Rachel Noble, she came out of the Delaware program and just has a really, really innate ability to be able to make the tests flow within a session. That was another piece I
Yeah.
hated, was like when you do a test, you're like, and you're only able to see the patient twice a week sometimes. It's like, I just waste half my training on this. And then they come back and their knees all blown up from that. And you got to take 2 weeks off from doing it. So we've spoken a lot about how to integrate the tests into a session so that one, you get PT buy-in, so the PT is comfortable at doing the test quickly and proficiently. It doesn't take up the whole test. And then secondarily, how do you do it in a manner that doesn't blow the front of their knee up,
Right.
like we're used to seeing if they have a BTB graft, for example. So that's what I've changed my mind on. I think mostly is like, how can I integrate those testing measures into the rehab?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, last but not least, what's the most important piece of advice to a rookie PT rehabbing their post-op ACL?
Their patients or their own?
Their patience.
Say that question again.
What's the most important piece of advice you would give to a rookie PT rehabbing their very first patient coming out of an ACL reconstruction?
One, definitely buy this course.
Buy this course, okay?
Shameless plug right there. I think, this is a really, really quick way to get better at this. So if you've got your first one walking in the door, you know, jump on this course, and you can take this course as you're treating the patient from day one all the way through the end. So you can just use it as like a confidence boost to kind of help you go along. But outside of that, I think mostly we talked about this a lot too. It's really learn the strength and conditioning principles surrounding, how to get like tissue to perform the way that you want it to,
Yeah.
to perform. So being able to apply the tempos, being able to apply different sets and rep schemes, different loading strategies, and how to progress and regress within those. I think that's a huge piece of this. That's not just ACL rehab, right? That's just being a good sports PT or being a good PT in
Yeah.
general. So, I think everybody needs to work on that. I need work on it now, 6 years out. Like I'm learning a lot of things from from different colleagues who are newer in the field that have a really good background in the latest and greatest. Um, but also when you first start, it's just like a huge bucket you need to fill, and the quicker you can fill that, the better your patients will be because of that.
Yeah. You've proven, even in your delivery of that answer, that you're a lifelong learner. So one of the things that makes true sports unique is that we're always trying to get better. Um, Tell us how you want to get that feedback so you can get better. How do we find you on Instagram?
Oh, cool. Yeah, sure. Okay, so I really only post stuff or communicate through my Instagram channel. So dr.stone.dpt. That's my handle. Um, if you want to look at some Squatoba content right now, that's
It's
going
there
on.
too. Yeah.
It's terrible. I'm dying, but we're hanging in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I post a good amount of stuff on there about just the nuances of ACL rehab, different patients, highlighting different people, not always success stories. Post some of the challenges that come with ACL. I am always open on that. DM me. I look at it
Too much.
too much.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's real. And I appreciate you, yes, we're experts in the field, but nobody's perfect. We're always learning. So give us some feedback. Hit Dr. Stone on Instagram. Hit us at True Sports PT on Instagram. We're always trying to get better. Tell us what you loved about the course. Tell us what could get better. We can't wait for all you guys to sign up for this course and to teach it both virtually, and then we're going to start in person too eventually. And just share your feedback. We love doing it. We love building it. Just help us make it better. Find us at True Sports PT. Thanks so much for listening, guys. There's way more to come. Bye bye.